listener. It's your dynamic duo of creativity and co-hosts, Chris
and Rick. Today on the podcast, we have John S. Couch, who is a multimedia artist, designer, and writer. He creates in multiple mediums, ranging from paintings to novels to nonfiction books to film and TV. He's the author of The Art of Creative Rebellion, a survival guide for the creative rebel, and professionally, he's recently served as VP of Product Design for Hulu, directing and overseeing the transformation of the streaming platform from 2016 to 2021. He has been consulting for the past 2 years, working in blockchain and metaverse initiatives, and currently he's consulting with the innovative AI company Versus AI. John is also working on a large exhibition for Mass MoCA, one of the largest contemporary art museums in the world, which is planned to come to life in the next few years. Here's John Couch. Hello, John, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Tell us, where did your creative journey begin?
Well, I think all children are born creative. It's how we learn language. It's how we explore the world. And my creative journey probably began at birth. And then what happens is that when I was really little, my grandmother used to give me reams of paper, and I would just occupy myself doing something that I wouldn't do now, which was drawing clowns. And at the time, I guess I found them to be very cool. And I was probably 2 years old when I really started drawing seriously, just never stopped, essentially.
You were kind of the kid that drew and drew and drew and drew and drew.
It's when you're in school, the weird thing is that I would just draw obsessively on my own. And then what you find is it started to attract a crowd. Other school children would actually be around your shoulders and looking over your shoulder and seeing what you're drawing. And then there's a magic in putting a line down and people have no idea what's happening. And then suddenly the line turns into a thing in front of the kids. And I thought that was kind of an interesting magic trick because I could already see in my head what was going to be down on paper, but they couldn't. And so they would often give me advice on what to do or take bets, so to speak, on what's he going to draw. And so I remember being in elementary school and realizing there was a huge power in the ability to create things out of my head with simple tools. And so I think that initial excitement and high never disappeared because the thing that's interesting about drawing, you draw with confidence. You draw with a pen or a marker. You don't take a pencil and then draw it, make it, Renaissance perspective correct, and then ink it afterwards. And what you do is you just make a statement and you go straight in. And I remember, now that I think about it, the wonderful sense of a tightrope walk as you started to lay down a mark and you kind of had a notion of what it was in your head, but you kind of let the thing become itself. And there's this back and forth between somewhat of an idea of what you're drawing and then what is actually coming out of your hand. And I thought there was something extraordinarily alchemical and magical about that dialogue between what my intention is and what's actually occurring on the paper. And then what I try to remind myself is that the exciting thing about art is the exploration. And children know this because they're just kind of taking a line for a walk, as Paul Klee would say. And what we do as we get older is we start to then go, no, it has to look this way. What happens is that we have such a strong sense of what the thing should be that we're in a constant state of disappointment that the drawing is not turning out the way that we have an idealized idea of how it should be. And when I was teaching life studies years ago, I remember adults in my class would be really upset because it didn't look like the thing that they were looking at. And what I tried to get them to realize is that they don't need to replicate reality. They need to feel into the thing, not have any expectations, and let the art reveal itself to them. And the moment they got rid of intention, the work became so much better every time. The moment you're looking at something and you have in your head an unfathomably difficult technique, I'm going to draw like Michelangelo or even Van Gogh, you're no longer yourself. What you are is you're trying to emulate something else and another ideal. And then what happens then is that you are going to constantly disappoint yourself. And by the way, even if you get it exact, you look just like fill in the blank, it's an empty kind of win because you haven't really done something which is from you, from your gut. And I do think all creative people need to go through a period of emulation. You study people, copy an exact replica of whatever they love, but you do this in the same way that in martial arts, you practice a move over and over and over until you finally get rid of the move, the technique. But you have to get to that point of saturation of doing anything just till you're completely, exhausted from doing it. You have the ability to then let it go and then allow things to kind of happen. And I found that that's a principle in general across the board, whether it's art or design or writing or learning a language. I think that the ultimate thing, whether you're talking about art, any kind of creativity, design, writing, music, is to get in that state of flow. And this is a long-winded way of saying I had to remember what it was like to begin at the very beginning when there wasn't a sense of like, it has to be good. That only happens when your grandmother puts the drawing on the refrigerator door, and now you have to live up to that standard. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, I got to do that again. And that's the loop that we get into, right? Like, oh my God, I got validated, so I have to keep getting validated. And so I think that's where you lose the joy in the work too.
Well, one, yes to
Yeah.
all of that, 100%. What I think I'm super interested, John, is how did you kind of keep up that momentum? How did you keep going to all the way through to where you are now? Because not very many people are able to continue to do it all the way to the point that you've taken your career.
To be clear, by the way, to be a good artist or a creative person does not require being a good drawer. You can be an excellent creative person without having any of the hand-eye coordination skills, which I think intimidates a lot of people. Just to be clear that drawing is a useful tool and it helps me personally to look at something, but in reality, a lot of my art is abstract, like this large green painting behind me. To most people, like, well, that's easy because, it's just a big green thing. But it took me my whole life to reduce the complexity of how I think down to a simple thing. But the reality is that there is no direct path. You have a supreme confidence in what you do as a child, and basically over time, whether it's lack of support from your family, societal pressure, or school, or you become a teenager, you get interested in other things. What happens is that you start to lose that thread. Oftentimes, in my case, I'll speak from my perspective. I lost the thread. I went into college as a pre-med student. And I remember being in class. I love science. I think it's fascinating, but I realized I was not meant to be a doctor. And in my sophomore year, I switched to art and design and felt immediately better. And do something like business or science or medicine, there's a utility behind it. And there's the ability to make money potentially. But in reality, what I did is I found that I was so much happier when I was in the art department and creating. But then what happened again is after I left college and I actually went to London and I worked in an art gallery when I was around 21. I was around a lot of creative people. I was around a very famous writer named William Burroughs, who wrote a book called Naked Lunch. I was very young and he was very old, and I was hanging a show in his gallery. And coming across him, though, I learned a lot. But I also met, Francis Bacon momentarily, a lot of people that influenced my work. And probably the most important person who influenced my work was a Japanese painter named Yoshida Kenji, and moved to Paris in the 60s. And what was interesting about him is that he had this amazing abstract work that he was doing in Paris. And so I went out and visited him, and he was kind enough to basically mentor me. The whole side story about Yoshida Kenji is this is a man who was a kamikaze pilot. And he was called up when he was 16 years old to fly out and essentially commit suicide, because what they did is they would put you into a plane with no parachute, and then they would weld you into the plane. So it's a one-way ticket. And on the day that he was being called up, the war was declared over. So he had this incredibly, difficult experience of like being certain that he was going to die, and everything was geared towards that, towards this opposite of that, which was like, I'm alive, I'm going to live. And so consequently, he became an artist because he thought, well, I'm going to reject all the practical social, pressures of like doing business and, being a conformist, essentially in that group. And he moved to Paris, where he didn't speak any French. In fact, when I met him, he still didn't really speak French. And he worked, in a fruit, stall, basically cleaning out the place during a farmer's market, and kept getting money. And then the good thing about the French government is they actually support the arts. And so he's able to get money. And then he spent, I think, close to 8 or 9 years saving money in Paris before he brought his wife over, who he had not seen in that entire time. And that's how devoted he was and how devoted they were to each other. She came out, she didn't speak French either, but within a few years, she learned French and actually wrote books in French. Crazy story. Anyway, he was a huge influence on me. Unfortunately, he passed, about a decade ago. But what I learned from him was a kind of fearlessness that it requires these big swings. It was a big swing because, not dying in World War II was a big one, but then also moving to Paris and not speaking the language, and just being, I'm going to show up. And he also taught me something. He saw me drawing one day and I was struggling and struggling, and he was just kind of watching me having a very difficult time drawing. And he goes, stop that. We're speaking Japanese, by the way. And he spoke a Japanese, which was like pre-World War II. So a lot of words I was not totally catching. And it was really kind of Shakespearean Japanese, so to speak. But we were able to communicate just fine. And he said, stop doing that. I go, what am I doing? And he goes, stop trying to make a painting, or stop trying to make a drawing. Stop trying to make anything. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he goes, art is not about making something. Art is about letting something out. And all you have to be is the conduit for that. A light went off in my head because I realized what I was trying to do is throttle, something into existence that I had this idealized in my head. And in reality, what you have to do is be brave enough to let whatever come out without censorship. Just whatever you are going through at that time, whatever technique you have, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, is what he was saying. I learned a lot from him. I came back to the States. I ended up, moving to San Francisco, where in the 90s it was the beginning of the digital revolution. Wouldn't it be interesting to figure out what this whole thing is about? So I picked up a magazine at at the bookstore, and it said Wired on it, and it was an all-white magazine at that time. And I thought, well, that's really cool. So I did the thing that you do, and I just showed up and said, hey, I'd like a job. And they go, well, coincidentally, we're opening up a Wired Japan. Would you be able to help on that? I'm like, yes. And did the classic thing too, like, can you use Photoshop? Can you use this different software? And I said yes. And of course, I didn't know how to use any of it. And I went and found friends of mine who had at the time cracked versions. This is before the cloud. And you basically had this serial number you put into it, and you put it on your computer using a thing called a CD. And so I just crammed and learned over the course of a few days and showed up to work. So what was interesting there is that the creative journey at that time pivoted me from being in the art world more into the design world. At that time, it was more about paper design, because it was Wired magazine. But ultimately, there's this thing that we started called hotwired.com, which now is called wired.com. And it was an experimental area where you at the time had no idea like how to do what's called UX now. At the time, it's like, you kind of take a magazine format and you put it on the web and you kind of hope that it works, because we always base everything on previous paradigms, right? So radio was kind of based on theater, and then you end up like going from that to movies and TV, and you kind of build on the previous paradigm. So I was working at Hotwired a bit. I learned how to do HTML at the time by going to websites and copying source code, and basically you just kind of took out the GIFs and JPEGs they were referencing, and you put your own in, and that's how you learned at the time. It's the old school. It's when you had dial-up modems. And what happened at that time is we were doing Wired TV using real media, and we had this nonlinear digital editing system called a Media 100, and it was kind of like the affordable version of the Avid. And I started learning how to do nonlinear digital editing and digitizing things. And it became a really interesting period of like, just how do you creatively take these different elements, which are nascent, like no one knew, what was going on. And I remember we had like real audio and we did an interview with like a Japanese punk band called Shonen Knife at the time. And we had all these, really kind of interesting people. But this is Wired was a warehouse and there'd be a music system playing. And you would see people like The Edge walking down the hallway with, Peter Gabriel. And you're like, my God, what's going on here? And I was, lucky enough to where I shared an office with a guy named Douglas Copeland, who wrote a book called Generation X at the time. And people like Neil Stevenson were around and they were writing articles for Wired. So it was a really interesting kind of hotbed of creativity. And I kind of got a sense of the different kinds of creative endeavors which were being put towards entrepreneurship at the time. Everything from Yahoo when they were first starting all the way, to eBay, to Amazon. And this is during the time in the mid 90s where people were telling me, well, I'll never buy anything on the internet. I'll never put my credit card into the internet. That's crazy. And what I learned a few things is that if something is scary, you should probably embrace it. And this is part of the creative thinking process. So in a lot of ways, Photoshop scared me initially because I thought, oh, it's going to destroy photography. It's going to destroy traditional ways. The internet was terrifying because it was going to destroy publishing, but it didn't. What it is, it just kind of yes and everything. And then what you learn, and this leads up all the way to now, where I recently last year was working with blockchain technology, and now I'm working with AI. These things initially, the human reaction is kind of one of revulsion, or the exact opposite, where people are like, I'm all in, and it seems like humans are very extreme. Either they're completely, pushing back against change or they're completely embracing of it. And I kind of take a middle way where I'm kind of like, a little bit repulsed, I'm a little bit interested, and I try to find out. So ultimately what happened is to kind of go from the 90s, Y2K was happening, nothing happened. The world didn't implode at that time. I moved to LA at that point, post the dot bomb and post 9/11, and everything just seemed like it was falling apart. LA had a lot of Silicon Valley people, because they're kind of saying, well, I told you so, it wasn't going to happen. This digital revolution thing was not going to happen. So when I moved to LA, there was this sense of like, well, what is the industry here that I can work in? So I ended up working as director of communications at MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art. And that was an interesting experience. Politically very difficult, but I was around a lot of things I loved. But I learned something there too, because I worked at MoCA, I worked at CBS where I was the head of interactive, and then I ended up working both in entertainment, all the way through for a while. And then I got into e-commerce where I was working at Magento and I was working at eBay, and then ultimately Hulu, where I oversaw the redesign of the platform. And currently, like I said, I'm consulting. But what was interesting through this whole journey is that I realized I was kind of doing what's called a shadow career the entire time, which what that means is that I wanted to be around the art. So I was working at a museum, but I really wanted to be an artist. I was working in the entertainment sector, heading up the platforms for the content, but I wanted to be a content creator. But I wasn't allowing myself these things because there's a higher risk profile involved with actually being a full-time creator. If you work for a large organization, you are guaranteed a paycheck every 2 weeks, insurance, X amount of money. And if you give your pound of flesh, then ultimately you'll be okay. But what was happening is my pound of flesh had disappeared and I was down to bone marrow, at this point. And I just could not handle the constant exhaustion that came around the structure around creativity. And I also found it really weird to me also that we all get into creativity going back to childhood because we love to make things. And yet somehow once creativity gets institutionalized, whether it's in a museum or a gallery, let's say for art, or if it's film or TV, then all this kind of creepy stuff happens around it. There's this infrastructure of support that then becomes ego-based. Suddenly it becomes less about the joy of creating a thing, and it becomes much more about the associative value of being next to someone who's famous. In the art world, it's kind of like, well, I know Jeff Koons, whatever that is, that becomes more important than the actual making of the thing. And so I kind of step back from all of that. And of course, I work with all these different companies, institutions, but what it took me until now to kind of flip my mental paradigm away from the idea of doing a job and then side hustling my creativity. And you have to do this, by the way. If you have a job, and you should have a job, if you have to pay for your family, for rent, for mortgage. But what happens is that you just side hustle. At a certain point, you lose steam on that too, because you're just exhausted from like trying to fit in the margins, your book, your screenplay, your art. And then 90% of the people just kind of like give up the ghost at that point because you get tired. I'm just tired. Like I'm dealing with life. My body's getting older. My energy is getting, less vibrant. I get less enthusiastic. And a number of people I've met in their mid 40s who just told me, I'm a creative director of a major company, but I am just empty. I don't know what I'm doing. And then I found that what was interesting is that for me, I had to flip it to where, no. I'm an artist first. That's the primary thing. And then everything I do, I'm going to do in service of that creativity. So if I take on a job, I'm going to apply like blockchain technology. I'm going to apply robotics. I'm going to apply AI. And I'm going to combine that with the handmade. And I'm going to find a synthesis because that's the world we live in right now. But what I do find in general is that the people I talk to who are like, well, I have nothing left. Well, it's because we lose our sense of purpose, I think, and it's easy to do that. It's easy when you're in your mid 40s to get existential. This is why it's called a midlife crisis. Like, I've worked my ass off. I finally got the title. I finally got the house. Maybe I didn't get the house and the title. Either way, it's kind of bad, because what you're doing is you're putting your sense of self towards an extrinsic, external sense of validation. And then when you get it, you're like, what happens next? What do I do with my life? And I didn't want to go through that. Every 10 years I was going through that. And so I said, no. What if I just put it all in black? What if I go all in and I take a fraction of the energy that I put towards someone else's company, someone else's product, and I just put it towards what I'm doing. And then I was able to then accelerate the process forward. But I hope this gives you a sense that there's never a linear approach to any of this. It's all zigzag. And you may have an intention of where you think you're going, but in reality, you have to be open to the pivot that's going to happen as you move forward.
But what you made me think is, I've met so many creative people who I'm like, what are you going to school for? Dentist. Why? You're phenomenal. Why are you going to be a dentist? I don't know what it is in creative. Like, as a dentist, back to your point, if I do this, I know what complete is.
Mm-hmm.
As a creative person, how do you get over the hard parts? What is I hate to say it, but the goal? Gotten over the hard part, how do you get over it, and how do you get the sense of accomplishment? Yay!
I mean, I think the idea of accomplishment's very personal to each person, and it doesn't have to be financial, but I do think the reason people become fill in the blank, nothing against dentists, but it's a very safe route. Like there's a clarity to it. I am going to help people with their healthcare, their teeth. By the way, I will make money doing that. And I think what comes down to the primary reason we give up being a poet by 27, where they give up being a rock star aspirations, or they give up whatever, is that they can't make money. And it comes down to the fact that we have to survive in this capitalistic environment that we're in this world. So how does one generate income while also being creative? And you'll notice that the majority of people who have made it are generally young when they first make it. So you make it as an artist generally in your early 20s. You make it as a writer, as a filmmaker. Most of the time, the reason why is that you have nothing to lose and you have a lot of time and you can just put everything into it. And then what happens over time is that you then, I don't know, don't have that confidence anymore, or you've been burnt a couple of times, it didn't work out, so you kind of stop. You take a temp job, the temp job turns into a full-time job. You find your significant other, Now you're spending money, you're now getting a place together, now you're married, now you have children, and now you're 40. And at that point, the idea of being a full-time writer or what have you seems like a distant memory. And it is for most people. And this is the weeding out of the process of whether you're really serious about what you're doing or not. Now, what's interesting about the creative process, though, is that I'm a big believer in the daily practice, and that every day you just do a little bit. You don't have to go all in. And I call it practice and not discipline. What I do personally is I schedule every morning an hour for writing, 3 hours for making art. And by the way, making art would include cleaning the studio and taking out the trash or whatever. But the point is to be in that space. Your brain can only absorb information a certain amount of time. And so you just focus for like 30 minutes and then you're done. And that's what I did. And then over time, then work started to just accrue. What I often tell people is stop thinking about it. I remember like talking to actually a designer who was working for me and just really cerebral, thought things through over and over. And one day he goes, well, I'd really like to learn Chinese. And I said, literally at that moment, what's stopping you? You have a supercomputer in front of you that you're talking to me through right now. As soon as this is over, you can go online and you can find any number of free courses to start you in learning Chinese, if that's really what you want to do. But what I have found also is that people will often say, well, I want to do a thing, but they don't really commit to it. If you really want to learn Spanish, I'm just using
Exactly.
language, as an example, right? If you want to learn Spanish, you can say, well, I'm going to learn Spanish someday. You're not. But if you say, I'm going to be in Madrid, Spain on February 13th in this particular cafe, and I will be speaking Spanish to the waiter, now your brain has specificity and it'll go, okay, I'm going to work backwards from that goal. And I'm a big believer in the brain being somewhat tricked into this. And so instead of kind of going, well, I'm going to get this someday, you have to think to yourself, it's already happened. So as an example, if you're a kid and you really, really want a red bicycle, and children are really quite good at this, that you'll obsess on it. You'll bug your parents. You'll bug your parents. Oh, I can't do it. I'm going to go, I'm going to take a side job. I'll mow lawns. I'll deliver newspapers, anything, because your goal is to get that red bicycle. You probably got that red bicycle by hook or crook. So what's interesting is that what happens is that children are very good at pre-visualizing what it is that they want. I really want that thing. And then they just do it until they obsessively get it. And I think what's interesting is if you are very clear with yourself about what it is you would like as an end state, then you think to yourself, it's already happened. Not that it will happen, it's already happened. And it's already happened like in 2025, this thing has already happened. And all you're doing, this is my product, management strategy, is you're now building, a schedule, a roadmap from here to then. And then all you're doing now is just going through the process of doing that, right? But it's important to convince yourself it's already happened. The secret kind of way, but it's more like if you do that, it also brings very strong clarity. And as an exercise, you can write down like, is this really what I want? Do I want to do this? And what I did a while ago is I said, well, I see myself living on a mountain. And I don't know why, but I did. And I see myself spending my time writing in the morning and making art in the afternoon. Very simple calculus. Currently, that's what I'm doing. And it snuck up on me. I live in Topanga, in Topanga Mountains, Santa Monica Mountains and Topanga Canyon. And it didn't happen overnight. But, what I had done is I pre-visualized it, I don't know, years ago. And subconsciously, I was working towards it. And that's where I had this aha moment. Why don't I just accelerate that by formalizing it and going, this is what I'm going to do. And then breaking it down diagrammatically. And then not obsessing over it, like, okay, I looked at it once, done, put it away. And then once you do that, it tends to like happen. But the thing is, everybody who has made it as a creative, has really done one thing that's really important. They've completely committed to doing it completely. And it's like getting married, like you can't kind of, oh, let's kind of get married. Once you're married, you're married. So I think you have to kind of like get married to the thing that you're doing. And again, like, it's not like I have to do this obsessively every day all the time. You can do that in your early 20s. Once you get past 30, you kind of have to pace yourself. Go like, well, I'm going to do it every day, no matter what. Like, I'm brushing my teeth. This is my sacred hour. It's from 6 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock in the morning, no matter what. It's before I get phone calls, before I get my Slack or whatever else is happening. And it's important to do that. The other thing that's important too is constant conflict throughout your day, no matter what. The idyllic situation is like, I'm in my studio and I'm creating and everything's great. In reality, you'll be doing that, and then the gas heater will go out, or the dog will throw up in the next room, or your car breaks down, or you find that you have a health scare. I mean, all these things will be bumps to take you out of it. So the question is, and this was my exercise, I discovered this during the pandemic, is that I would spend a lot of time, I don't know, doing meetings, and then I would do HR stuff and spreadsheets. And then, by the end of the day, I'm like, I don't feel like doing anything. Just want to eat something and watch TV. It just felt like I was going into a lower state of creativity and energy the entire time. And so I thought, well, is there a way, because I'm always going to get interrupted, to where I can find moments between stuff to make work, and I remember reading about this Japanese American artist named Ruth Asawa. She became a famous sculptor, and she was married, and she was Japanese American during a time where it was difficult to get anything done. And she had, I think I may get this number wrong, like more than 5 children. So she's dealing with all these different things, and she's making art in her kitchen, in between things. And someone asked her, like, how do you do this? And she goes, I work in 10-minute intervals. In 10 minutes, I can do something. And I thought, wow, I'll do that. And so what I did is I just simply moved from like doing a spreadsheet to then laying down some paint, to then, cooking lunch, to coming back into doing the spreadsheet, to then, writing for a little bit. And then what I realized, what was important was not the activity, but it's the zen of, like, when you eat, when you sleep, sleep, when you work, work. In other words, just do that thing that you're doing at the time, which allows you to stay in a state of flow. So the important thing is not the activity, it's a state of awareness and flow that you're in. Because if you're in a state of flow, then you'll bring the same attention to doing boring stuff as you would to the things you are doing, which are, quote, interesting. You just have to maintain a higher level of consciousness throughout the whole thing, which takes training. So the way I did it is I started meditating every morning. Started out like doing 5 minutes, worked my way up to 10 minutes to 20 minutes, and learned how to get into that state of centeredness. And then throughout the day, I would take, 5-minute moments where I using apps to sometimes just breathing. But I think that those moments allowed me to get out of this ADD world that we're in, because we're constantly being bombarded by life, number one, and then your phone, and then work. So your brain has a constant sense of being in a state of shallow kind of awareness of everything, so that by the end of the day, you're just tired. But what's interesting is if you go deep with whatever it is you're doing at the moment, it gives you energy. And that's the other thing that I learned, is that most people have this internal idea of like, well, I have a battery when I wake up and it's fully charged when I wake up, or maybe it's 80% charged. And then by 3 o'clock, it's pretty much tapping out. And I thought, well, that's kind of a crappy way to think about energy. So I thought, well, what if I think of it in terms of like energy is constant and it's a flow. And if I allow myself to open up, then I can actually get more energy through, the idea of qi, or qi in Chinese. And I thought, well, how do I then open up? It's like less about losing energy. It's more like constricting energy. So that if I sit and meditate for a moment, then I can open up that portal again and the energy comes through. And then I think that's important, especially if you're creating and you want to get a lot of big things done, is learning how to recover. And I think the trick is number one, we don't rest. We're just in a constant state of low grade anxiety, and we're working all the time, and we're worried about everything that we can't handle. And then what's interesting, I think, is actually to like get out of that state of like diffuse light into focus, where you focus really hard for like 30 minutes on something, and then you rest for like 15 minutes, and then you focus really hard, and then you rest for like an hour, whatever it is. But I've been really terrible about this throughout my career. how do you rest? And I'm learning how to rest better now.
Right. So you have just dropped so many helpful life tips in general on everyone. Tons of great value here, John. Thank you. But I will ask, because I'm selfish, what would maybe one more piece of advice that you would want aspiring creatives to really hone in on?
I think that's interesting is that most people don't create because they're in a constant state of comparison. Like someone is always going to be better than you. Someone is always doing something more extraordinary. And what I try to tell, like my daughter, for example, the fact that you exist at all is like an almost impossible statistically situation. I mean, not to get into like, science versus belief, but essentially whatever you believe, it's pretty unlikely that you're here. And there's been, I don't know how many billions of people that have been born and died before you, and how many more are going to be born after you and die. So, there was a part of me that actually stopped creating because, like, I would go into a bookstore and look at all the books and go, well, who am I to write another book? Yeah, and I think what stops a lot of people is this sense of like, why should I do anything? What do I have to contribute? Who am I to say anything? And I would tell them that, by the very fact that you are here, and without trying to sound cheesy, you're a miracle. It's a miracle that you are here at this moment. And I believe it is a moral imperative that if you have a creative fire inside of you, and maybe it's just an ember right now because it's been neglected, but if it's there, it's important, probably in this time period more than ever, to let it out. I think we need creative mindset, and we need creative thinkers more than ever. Because when you don't have creative mindset and creative people in a society, you have people that are easily manipulated because they don't question authority. And in reality is that art by its very nature, and the reason why art has been censored, whether it's music, art, or literature, is because of the fact it's rebellious. It actually questions what is. And there's a lot of comfort in conforming. There's a lot of comfort in feeling like you're part of a community of people of like mind, but there's also a big danger in that. So my advice, for creative people is to not be afraid, of like technology, like what AI is going to do or what new tools are coming out, but look at it in terms of like, how does it enhance you as a human being? And therefore, how does it enhance the human race? And how does it help the earth? And I think once you kind of move away from the idea of creativity as being ego based, like, you know, Rick, you've got to be famous, or Chris, you've got to be famous, or I've got to be famous. Even if you attain that, it's kind of like, ugh. But if you actually think in terms of like, how can I actually help the world without being ostentatious, but how can my work alleviate suffering, allow people to be inspired, then I think you have something which is purposeful, and it will help you get through the difficult periods. When you feel like you're doing something that is for other people and at the service of other people in addition to oneself, then I think you have a winning combination. But if it's all about like, well, how can I get, famous, fabulous, and rich, then you might get there, but ultimately it's kind of a very boring and kind of empty way to go through life, I think. So whenever you are, creating, think of it as a gift. What you're doing is you're giving a gift to the world, and don't worry about making money from it, because if it's done with true authenticity, and I don't mean originality because everything has been done before, but if it's done with true authenticity, it'll reverberate with a lot of people, and then that'll get you through. So final, thing is like, doesn't matter what kind of creative expression you do, just make sure it's authentically you, and I think you're golden.
So so you and I can talk because we're buddies, but how can other people find you? Like, what do you have on social media? Some websites, what projects you have coming out? Because I truly believe, you're one of the great creatives out there.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, my website is pretty simple. It's john-couch.com. On the socials, like Instagram, I'm at Shadow and Sun Art. There's periods between all of those. but you can find me. Also, I guess, it was, I guess, the formerly known as Twitter, now X, is my old handle is Titanium Sky. That comes from William Gibson years ago, and he described the color of the sky as a signal of like a TV signal tuned to a dead channel. And I thought that was a beautiful titanium sky image. And on LinkedIn, you can find me. So, please reach out. I'd love to stay in contact with anybody who wants to talk about creative work.
And your book.
So my book is called The Art of Creative Rebellion, and you can find The Art of Creative Rebellion on Amazon or anywhere. But that book came out of a presentation I did at South by Southwest years ago, and what happened is after I gave the speech, I had a lot of people come up and say, like, "Do you have a book?" My wife and daughter were there, and they said, "Well, why don't you just write the book that you wish you had coming up as a creative?" And so I did, and it's called The Art of Creative Rebellion. I think a lot of what I talked about and a lot of the principles are in that book too.
Amazing. Thank you, John. We will get all of those links to your book, to all of your socials, etc., into the show notes, and so people can easily find you and connect. Thank you so much for your time. Any last thoughts that you would like people to know, or anything else you want to give a shout out to, anything like that?
Oh my God, I think I've given a lot of thoughts out on this one. The thing is, life takes a lot of courage just to truly be awake. And I think what happens is that we have numbed ourselves, collectively as human beings. And we do this, because we're trying to avoid pain. We're trying to get to pleasure. That's just a human biological imperative. And so what happens is that we end up like numbing ourselves with food, alcohol, drugs, affairs, social media, all these things we do. And there's no judgment on this, but what I have found is that when I start to strip away all these things, I felt a lightness. And what happens is you get back to your original face. And your original face, again, this is a Zen concept, is the original essence of who you are that you were born with. And I think that to be an artist is to reconnect with that. And when you do that, the only way you can do that is you get away from a lot of bad habits. I'm not saying don't have a drink. I'm not saying don't eat a hamburger occasionally. I'm just saying don't rely on things as a way to mitigate you in life. Life is actually not painful and difficult if you're in it right now. What's difficult and painful about life is your memory of trauma from the past and your fear of what might happen in the future. But if you're actively in this moment right now, you're probably okay. And if you're really in this moment right now, you will do something extraordinary creatively, just automatically. It'll happen because you're here. And when I find that I'm not doing good work, it's primarily because I'm not here. I'm somewhere else. And it's very difficult right now in this, climate change, political strife, economic instability world. But if you can find your center and then really kind of settle into that, things will happen automatically. It's counterintuitive because we think we're like, oh my God, I got to worry. But no, you don't. The world's not going to fall apart for 10 minutes. Sit down and actively be bored. Sit down and look out your backyard and just stare at a thing and empty your mind. If you can't meditate, just sit and observe the light, observe the trees, observe the birds without judgment. Don't think bird, tree, light, just let it kind of be. And then when you do that, I have found things on their own accord start to open up rapidly. As Ram Dass said, be here now.
Be here now. Thank you again, John. This was a total pleasure.
Yeah, that's great.
Amazing.
Great catching up, you guys.
Thank you for joining Rick and myself on another episode of Origins, A Creative Journey, a Designer Con production. Please like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, download and listen to us every place you get your favorite podcast. Follow us on Instagram at Origins, A Creative Journey, all one word. Drop us an email for thoughts, ideas, or maybe somebody you'd like us to interview at deconpodcast@gmail.com. And make sure you join us in Las Vegas for DesignerCon, North America's premier annual design convention. All the information can be found, including tickets, at designercon.com. Till then, enjoy your own creative journey.